Hello, welcome back to the channel. Got something a bit different for you today. These are some old photos I took back in about 2002 at a museum called Red Park, which is about a half-hour drive from Tsukuba Circuit. I wasn't planning to visit this museum actually on the day. I'd gone out to Tsukuba Circuit for an event which apparently got cancelled that morning. So I'd gone quite a long way to do nothing. A couple of the officials at the track took pity on me for that, and one of them gave me a lift down to this museum so I'd have something to do. At the time, they weren't really keen on people doing photography inside the museum because they didn't want people producing books and making money from their collection. Luckily, the guy who gave me a lift there did a bit of negotiating, and in the end, I just used a small digital camera. I think only about 3.3 megapixels, something like that, which convinced them that I wasn't going to be publishing a book. The photos I'm going to show you here are basically a vertical tasting of Prince and Nissan Skylines from the very first one right up until the R34, which at the time I was there was still the current model. What you see here is the original Prince Skyline from 1957. Nothing very interesting about it, to be honest. It was typical post-war Japanese fare. It was only a 1.5 litre four-cylinder with about 60 horsepower. So yeah, not much to get excited about. But that was the first G series Prince engine, which the later six-cylinder used in the Skyline was based on. And this is where they started getting interesting. In 1964, Prince wanted to compete against Porsches and a lot of other 2-litre cars that were in the touring car racing in Japan at the time. At the time, their main sedans were the Gloria, which was a fairly large sedan, not really suited for racing, and the Skyline you see here. Unfortunately, the Skyline had quite a short nose, so they couldn't even fit a 6-cylinder motor in it. Their solution was to add 8 inches or 200 millimeters to the front of the car. So essentially, they moved the front axle forward and just added extra car in between the windscreen and the wheels. This allowed them to fit their new G7 2-litre. In the Gloria, it made 107 horsepower, and it was actually the first Japanese engine to make more than 100 horsepower. I believe this is an S54A, which originally came with a 2-barrel carburetor, but you could actually order it from the factory with triple 40mm Webers. The GTB version that came out in 1965 had the Webers standard and also a larger fuel tank and an LSD, which made it a reasonable race car. Did quite well in Japan, although they were never hugely successful in Australia. They did enter them in Bathurst, but most of them were DNFs. If I remember old stories from old racing fans, I think they had a 5-bearing crank which couldn't handle the sustained high RPM of Conrod Straight in particular. But I really can't find reliable information about what happened to the cars in the race. So here is that G7 engine with the triple Weber carburetors, the 40 DCOE carbs. I have read some conjecture online about whether or not they use Solexes or Webers. Apparently, the Prince cars were using Webers, but I think the later Nissans at some point changed over to Solex. Very similar carburetors anyway. And here is an ex-race car, one that would have been raced in Japan. You may notice the fiberglass bonnet, presumably for weight saving, and there's also an oil cooler under the bumper there with the exposed oil lines, which is sort of a classic look for early Japanese race cars. And what you see here is the first Skyline to wear a Nissan badge. It was the C10 model, starting in 1968. And the first one to be called a GTR was the PGC10, which came out in 1969. Instead of the G7 engine, they had the S20 twin cam 24-valve engine, also with the triple carbs. That was actually a variation of the Prince R380 Le Mans engine, which in its final form actually made 220 horsepower, which in the mid-60s was incredible for a 2-litre. This version made 160 horsepower, but importantly, it revved to 7,000 RPM, which made it a lot more flexible as a race car engine. And here's an example of one of the Japanese race cars from the time. They had those sort of aerodynamic covers over the headlights. Don't know how much they helped, but they certainly gave it a unique look. I think they also changed to a fiberglass front bumper, and it looks like it doesn't have a rear bumper at all. These were still the days of steel wheels for racing, though. Then in 1971 came the coupe version, the two-door KPGC 10. Essentially the same car, just two doors instead of four. It also had the little spoilers front and back, and the rear wheels had over fenders so they could run bigger tyres. From the factory, they didn't have front over fenders, but they were a very common thing to be added later on. This car's also got Watanabe wheels on it, which did not come from the factory, they just had steel wheels. And here is the S20 engine, which is a pretty awesome looking bit of kit. They came with the 40mm carbs, but apparently for racing they often used 45s. And pretty much everyone I've seen has got these very fancy exhaust headers. I'm not sure whether or not that's what they got from the factory, but yeah, as I said, I've never seen one without them. This is obviously not a completely standard car. It's got upgraded ignition and suspension tops and a strut brace that wasn't included back then. But still, in most ways, it's a very nice example. I did make quite a lot of the KPGC 10 coupes, and they were very successful at racing in Japan. I think they won the 71, 72 seasons. And then in September 1972, they replaced it with the KPGC 110, which is better known as the Ken Mary shape. In Australia, it was a 240K shape. They wound up only producing it for 6 months and produced, I think, 197 cars, which makes it one of the rarest GTRs ever. Basically, the fuel crisis came along and Nissan decided they weren't really interested in racing anymore. So that has made that model extremely expensive to buy. Even back then, they were worth close to $200,000. I wouldn't be surprised if they're more around the million mark if you've got one now. The engine setup, I think, was identical in these cars. Unlike the previous one, they did come with the over fenders on the front guards as well. If I'm not mistaken, the love heart under the bonnet there is a Ken and Mary sticker, which probably wasn't there from the factory. Ken and Mary were two fictitious people used in the advertising for the car at the time. And here is a typical Ken Mary race car, not necessarily based on the GTR. As you can see, this one's got a fiberglass nose cone, big spoiler, really big guards. At the time, a lot of their racing was speedway style. They didn't have winding corners. It was just one big oval, not necessarily banked. But if you look at pictures of Fuji Speedway from back in the 70s, there were very few corners. It was just a high-speed run. So obviously they wanted to get a lot more width on the track for stability. Unfortunately, after the Ken Mary model, things took a bit of a downturn. It was what was known as the malaise era in America, and it was kind of the same in Japan. Because they suddenly had to meet a lot of pollution standards around the world, the engines lost a lot of power. This is one of the later GT2000s, which had a turbocharged, fuel-injected L26 cylinder, which only made 145 horsepower, which was pretty dismal. And the car was quite a lot heavier than the C110 as well, so it really didn't have great performance. In Australia, we had the export version, which had a 2.4-litre injected motor, and despite being non-turbo, that made 142 horsepower. So the performance was almost the same as the turbo version. On a side note, my auntie had one of these, and because I was 7 years old, I thought the coolest thing about it was that it had power windows. Luckily, everything changed in 1981 when they brought out the R30 series Skyline, which brought the FJ20 twin cam 2-litre 4-cylinder. In a non-turbo form, this motor made 150 horsepower. The first turbo version made 190, and then the facelift model gained an intercooler, a little bit different turbo, and a bit better compression. Went from 8 to 1 up to 8.5 to 1, and it made 205 horsepower, which I think made it the first Japanese engine to make more than 200 horsepower. It was a much more modern design, and it was actually lighter too. So it became quite successful in racing. This is the updated version, which came in 1983. It was nicknamed the Tekamen in Japan, which means Iron Mask, obviously because it didn't have a full-size grille like the earlier one. And this is certainly the most memorable version of the DR30. Uh, in fact, it's probably one of the best-looking race cars ever to come out of Japan. This car was raced by Masahiro Hasemi in 1982 and 1983. It was a very successful car, won many rounds. Interestingly, though, it didn't use the FJ20. It had an LZ20B, which was an engine made specifically for motor racing. Of course, a lot of people know about this car because it appeared in Gran Turismo. I can't remember which version. So the next Skyline to come was the R31 in 1985. They got rid of the four-cylinder and brought the RB20. These are known as the red top RB20s, which were not as good as the later ones found in the R32. This particular car, though, was a GTSR, which came out in 1987, and they had an engine called the RB20DTR, which had the later ECCS style inlet manifold. It also had a tubular exhaust manifold with I think it was a TO4E turbo, and they made 210 horsepower factory, although racing versions made over 400 horsepower. These were also the first cars to feature high-cast four-wheel steering and an active spoiler on the front. And that's one of the cars that was pretty famous in Japan at the time. Of course, then in 1989, the R32 model came along, and the BNR32 GTR pretty much changed everything. It was an enormous leap forward in technology, and it was extremely successful. It dominated Japanese touring cars for about 4 years, I think. And the later R33 and R34 versions also did extremely well. But this was an amazing car. It had the RB26 twin turbo, which made 280 horsepower, so it was a huge step forward from the R31. Also, it had the Atessa four-wheel drive system. It also had high-CAS four-wheel steering, and it was also extremely successful in Australia, dominating the Group A touring cars there, to the extent that they basically dissolved the formula because no one could beat the GTR. This particular one is the V-Spec, which is easy to spot with the 17-inch wheels and the big holes in the bumper to get more air into the intercooler. They also had some driveline and braking upgrades, so they're just a bit more desirable than the basic BNR32. This car is an Autech version, the GTB4, which you might notice it's actually got a Prince badge on the back. Autech had a non-turbo version of the RB26, which they strangely put in front of an automatic gearbox in the four-door. Another really obscure car. It wasn't particularly impressive to drive. It made 220 horsepower, and it was actually slower than a normal GTST with the Silvertop RB20 turbo, which made 205 horsepower, but quite a lot more torque than this engine. And of course, this is the Calsonic R32, which is probably the most famous of all the BNR32s racing in the era. In fact, I think last year this one was taken to the Festival of Speed in Goodwood, and it looked pretty awesome going up that track. And really their biggest limitation back then was the aerodynamics, which were improved for the next model. So it's an R33 sedan on the right. I think that is the Autech version, which had GTR running gear, and they made 447 of them, apparently. You could buy a four-wheel drive sedan version of the R33, which a lot of people would then swap the RB26 into, but Autech actually did it as a model you could buy from the dealer. This, I think, is a really early pre-production version of the R33 GTR, which came out in 1995 and went all the way through till the end of 1998, which is one of the reasons it had a much higher production run than any other GTR and is pretty much the easiest one to find if you want to buy one. It was a little bit bigger and a little bit heavier than the R32, but there were a lot of other improvements to the chassis, which meant it was actually quicker, especially around the Nürburgring, than the R32 was. And this is a JGTC version from the time. Obviously, it has a lot wider guards, and they were allowed to run a lot more aero on these versions. As you can see, they still run twin turbos. They're restricted to 500 horsepower for the class. So the twin turbos were probably still the most responsive option available. And then came the R34. Thanks to the big guards and all the aero, it was pretty hard to tell it apart from the R33 unless you saw it directly from the front or the back. Then you could recognize the taillights and the headlights. These had a much more advanced cooling system, as you can see, with the V-mount radiator and intercooler. The engine seems to sit really low in the engine bay in these ones too. I don't know how they got it quite that low. But again, they were restricted to 500 horsepower. So it's kind of surprising that they stuck with the six-cylinder. By this time, the Toyota Supras were actually running a 2-litre four-cylinder instead for better weight balance. So that was it for the Skylines in the museum. As I said, this was around 2002. So the V6 Skylines hadn't even come out yet. They did have a couple of other things to look at, though. This is an R380. This is the Dash 2, which raced in 1967, I think, at 24 Hour Le Mans, and was quite successful. It actually came second, I think, in its class, behind the Porsche. And this is the GR8 engine that it ran. It was a 2-litre straight six. I think in this particular version it made 200 horsepower, and a later one it made 220. And I think it had 11-to-1 compression. And basically a less extreme version of this engine is what wound up in the 1971 GTR. You can see some pretty obvious differences though. It's got separate covers on the cams, and it's also got a water manifold going in behind each spark plug you can see there, which was obviously to improve cooling for a 24-hour race engine. And of course the 6-into-2 headers, which look absolutely awesome. They also had this 1998 R390 GT1. I think this is the one that was built as a homologation road car, which had a detuned version of the VRH35L V8, made 350 horsepower. Actually, they said it made over 350 horsepower, and they claimed it could do 349 kilometers an hour, I think, although that doesn't ever seem to have been tested. I find it interesting that they used the Z32 300ZX headlights in it. The racing version of these did compete in Le Mans for a couple of years and did pretty well, but they were never quite able to beat the Porsches. I think the best they got was third. And there is the 3.5-litre V8. And you can also see the pushrod suspension in the rear. It was certainly a pretty ridiculous car to have on the road. And finally, they had the Mid-4 concept car, and right next to it, the Mid-4 2, which came a little bit later. I think they came out in 1985 and 1987, respectively. The earlier one had a normally aspirated VG30 quad cam V6, which made 230 horsepower in that version. And the later one had a twin turbo, which made 330. And that was the engine which ultimately wound up in the 300ZX Z32. It's hard to tell whether or not Nissan were ever serious about making this as a production road car. But you can't help noticing a lot of the styling cues found their way into the NSX a couple of years later. Anyway, that's it for my little tour of Red Park Motor Museum. As usual, thanks for watching. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you again soon. Cheers.